Hi friends, I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. One of the finest books of poetry of the 20th century is a volume entitled The Age of Anxiety. It was written by W.H. Auden, and it was a direct expression of the tension and the anxiousness that all of us felt in that horrible period that we call the Cold War, a tense standoff between world nuclear powers that basically lasted from the end of the Second World War to 1989, when one of those superpowers, the Soviet Union, disintegrated. But you and I live in a new age of anxiety now, one that Auden, I think, would find quite remarkable. It's an age in which we are increasingly worried about the continued integrity of the planet on which we live. We know that climate change is a reality, and we know that climate change is largely due to human activities. And we also know, don't we, that if we stopped all of those activities right now, the damage to the environment would continue for years ahead. That's just how advanced the deterioration is. And this causes a great deal of anxiety on our part, because who can wrap their minds around the devastation and perhaps even the destruction of the ecosystem? A fascinating article appeared in the June issue of the New Yorker. It was written by Jill Lapierre, and in it what she does is to compare the dystopias that are being written now with the dystopias that were written just a few years ago. Now, a dystopia, as you know, is a literary genre that attempts to depict a perfectly horrific society. It's the opposite of a utopia, which tries to depict a perfect society. In the past, dystopias, no matter how bleak their vision of this horrific society was, offered a way out. They seemed to be a literary genre that suggested that resistance was possible against the worst thing that human beings could do to one another or to the planet. But dystopias now, in the wake of climate change, according to Ms. Lapierre, are written without that aspect of resistance to them. Instead of being dystopias of resistance, she says they have become dystopias of submission and resignation and desperation. Sometimes, in other words, a literary genre can capture the mood of a culture, and she wants to argue that current dystopias have done precisely that. Now, this is interesting, but it's also sad and frustrating, because it seems to me that as we become more radically pessimistic, we lose more and more the possibility of a way of thinking about reality and our place in it that is absolutely vital. I'm talking about hope. Hope, as you know, is one of the three theological virtues, according to St. Paul, the other two being faith and love, or charity. But hope is also a universal human characteristic that all people, regardless of whether they're religious or not, are desperately in need of. So what do we mean by hope? Well, we frequently use the word to indicate a specific or concrete wish, don't we? We say that we hope for something that we perceive as good to come about to replace a situation that we don't see as quite good, or we hope for a continuation of a concrete situation that we see as good and beneficial and conducive to well-being and happiness. We may be deceived, we may be mistaken about what actually is good, but that's generally the formula, if you will, for hope. That's not the kind of hope that I'm talking about. The kind of hope that I have in mind is the hope that was discussed by the French Catholic existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel. Marcel died in 1973, and even though he's not quite as well known as his atheist existentialist contemporaries, Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, and Albert Camus, or Simone de Beauvoir, I think that his philosophy has something that their philosophy doesn't, that can address the current malaise that we seem to be suffering from. Marcel said that the kind of hope he has in mind is called for, is elicited from being in a state of despair. What does it mean to fall into despair? Well, it means, according to Marcel, to feel that one is trapped, that one's future is over, that one has been, as he said, plugged in a hole from which there is no exit. When we fall into this kind of despair, everything seems dark, everything seems bleak. But what we have to keep in mind, Marcel says, even though we can just barely perhaps keep it in mind, is that we live in a universe which is purposeful. We live in a universe which has been created by a benevolent and wise deity, and that no matter how bleak and horrible things might appear to be now, there is, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, a curvature to reality, a curvature that bends towards justice, fulfillment, righteousness. And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves again and again and again, even if we can barely utter the words, even if the despair that we are resisting is so great that we can barely lift our eyes to the heavens. Let me read you what Marcel himself has to say about this kind of hope. He expresses it, I think, rather beautifully. Hope, he says in a little book of his entitled The Philosophy of Existentialism, hope consists in asserting that there is at the heart of being a mysterious principle which is in connivance with me. And what he means by in connivance with me is that it is in sync with me. It recognizes my wish for well-being, and it shares that wish. Marcel says that this kind of hope can only be cultivated in humility. It's the hope of an individual who knows that there is nothing ultimately that she can do to lift the despair. She places the despair in the hands of the benevolent universe, in the hands of the purposeful God. That may not seem like a great deal of consolation to those of us who live in the current age of anxiety, but Marcel thinks that it ought to be. What we ought always to do is to recognize that the universe in which we live is not meaningless, much less chaotic, much less malevolent. I can think of no better expression of this kind of hope, this fragile but strong kind of hope that Marcel is talking about, than a passage from an extraordinary memoir written by C.S. Lewis. The memoir I have in mind is entitled A Grief Observed. I actually think it's the very best of all of Lewis's books. It's a memoir that he writes after his wife, Joy Davidman, dies. Her death sends C.S. Lewis reeling. He has lost the rather optimistic and complacent, if I can put it that way, faith that he had practiced for most of his life. His world shatters when she is taken from him, and he falls into what can only be described as that black hole of despair that Gabriel Marcel talks about. And in that black hole, he feels that he has no more resources left. He hasn't the strength to pull himself out of it. And he doesn't trust God to pull him out of it either, until something happens. And I'd like to read you the passage. It's again from the book A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. He writes, "Something happened last night. One moment last night can be described in similes. Otherwise, I can't put it into language at all. Imagine a man in total darkness. He thinks he is in a cellar or dungeon, and then there comes a sound. He thinks it might be a sound from far off, waves or wind-blown trees or cattle half a mile away. And if so, it proves he's not in a cellar, but free in the open air. Or it may be a much smaller sound close at hand, a chuckle of laughter. And if so, there is a friend just beside him in the dark. Either way, a good sound." There's not a whole lot to grasp onto here with gusto. Lewis isn't saying that the world is right and everyone is going to be perfectly happy, but he has now this glimmer that he's not alone, that the darkness isn't impenetrable, and that as horrible as the current situation that he finds himself in is, the universe itself, directed as it is by a benevolent God, remains what it is. Purposeful, meaningful, and friendly. That's the hope that Marcel enjoins you and me to hang on to when we find ourselves plugged in that dark hole from which there is no exit. My friends, I don't know what's going to happen when it comes to climate change. We, I think, should prepare ourselves for the very, very worst. But I think we should also keep in mind that we belong, as Lewis realized, to a universe which is not going to leave us alone. There is that voice in the dark that we can depend upon, difficult as it may seem to locate it at times. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. God bless you, and thank you very much.